I went to France and discovered what my son was doing to his wife. I say that sentence the way a teacher reads the first line of a troubling essay. Slowly, once, so everyone can hear the problem before we begin to parse it. We had planned the trip as a small, ordinary thing, a reunion across the channel, an excuse to see a house that had become a family story in photographs, an old chateau set back from a road lined with plane trees, marble floors inside, a silver-carved mirror that caught the late light. I flew because I wanted to sit with him, to hear about the work he had taken up and the ways adulthood had been reshaped by a marriage I had watched from a distance. Instead, I walked into an ordinary domestic accident that would not stay ordinary. It was a champagne glass. Not dramatic, a slender flute that slipped from a hand, skimmed the marble, and burst into a scatter of tiny knives. The sound is what stopped me first. Bright, clear, 100 small strikes like an eraser on a blackboard. People startle at glass. It's a reflex. My son moved instinctively to gather the pieces. His movement was quick, but his fingers trembled. His wife, standing by the window with a scarf wound too tightly at the throat, looked down at her hand, and then, with that same steadiness that married people develop to avoid making scenes, she said it had been clumsy. They laughed it off. Guests offered speechless apologies. It would have been easy to let it be one of those moments you file away as an anecdote that does not belong in an investigation. Except for one thing. Beneath the sleeve that showed when she drew a cloth over the broken glass, there was a crescent of bruising, pale and carefully hidden. It could have been anything, an old injury, the result of a fall, but familiarity in my gaze has a way of reading people the way I used to read essays, and this bruise did not match the explanation. It was too discreet, too measured. It looked like something meant to be unseen. I teach, or I used to. Grading taught me to notice small inconsistencies. A comma out of place reveals attention or distraction. An off-kilter verb betrays misunderstanding. I began at once to mark little things that, alone, would mean nothing. A voicemail that lasted 3 seconds and then ended. Pictures he would send where her face was never shown, just the backs of heads, the outline of a neck. Photographs of table settings, silver, crystal, but never of the private rooms where a person is most themselves. Language that slipped, people who talk about family as if that word locks doors rather than opens them. I started to count, not because I thought counting would suffice for grief, but because counts build cases. A single bruise is anecdote. A ledger of similar notes is a pattern. I counted the phone calls that seemed to be timed around the household's routines. I counted the receipts he sent in emails, payments listed as domestic maintenance, tiny sums missing where one would expect wages to appear. I counted the ways his wife addressed him in public messages, deferential, passing over specific needs in favor of generalized thanks. It was, I tell you as plainly as I can, as if the household lived under a vocabulary of discretion. The first concrete thing I put my hand on was domestic and small, a rag, damp with perfume, tucked behind a cushion in the sitting room. It should not have been there. It smelled of lavender and something else, an antiseptic note that did not belong to the adorning smells of the house. When I asked about it casually, the way one asks a question in class to see what the students will say, Marguerite, the steward, answered too quickly. Her hands left the teacup a half-second before she looked up. She said the rag had been used to dry a wine spill. I made a note. Notes are ordinary things. A page of neat observations in a notebook does not feel like anything powerful when you write the first line. But a note multiplied becomes a map. Once you have a map, you can see where paths cross. There were other small crossings. A stack of mail kept behind a file cabinet held a bank envelope from Geneva, folded around a bank card. The envelope was stamped in a manner I recognized from a year spent reading case studies. Confidential relations. A ledger, thin, leather-bound, and soft at the edges, was concealed beneath the false bottom of a drawer in a bedroom bureau. It looked handmade. The handwriting in it was not the neat cursive of a social diary, but a ledger's shorthand. Names, sums, dates, and a string of initials I could not parse at first. Next to some entries, someone had written one-word notes: room, transport, discretion. Across the top margin of one page, in a different hand, was an instruction that stopped me like an unexpected exam question. If I disappear, see Vault 24. I should have left at that moment. A sensible person would have closed the drawer, replaced the rag, and boarded a plane home. Confrontation in private between families and wealth often slides into settlement. It is quieter, less destructive to reputations. I understand why many would choose it. The offer of hush is a soft thing: cash, apologies, mediation. Discretion, the word kept coming up, like some genteel smokescreen for arrangements that demand secrecy. But the ledger was not discretion in the good sense. It catalogued movements and payments to names that did not belong to the household staff on the official roster. And tucked into the back of the ledger, wrapped in wax paper, was a small flash drive with a thin label: if. That one syllable struck me like a bell. If what? If who? If when? There was a professional logic to it that left a chill. A dead man's switch does not shout. It waits. I had to be careful. I have taught generations what to look for in a thesis and how to distinguish firm claims from conjecture. The ethical line is sharp. No leap from suspicion to accusation. No use of gifts of trust for vengeance. I took photographs of the ledger with my phone, discreet, only the headers and the dates, making sure not to expose personal details that would harm people later. I wrote the time on the page and the room and the way light fell. When someone asked what I was doing, I said I was keeping a record, that old habit of a teacher coaxing evidence out of conversation. I did not say that I felt the ground shift beneath this house. I did one other thing that many would think small, but that, in time, proved to be decisive. I put the flash drive in an envelope and sent an email to myself with a succinct line in the subject: if Vault 24. I wanted a timestamp outside of that room, a trace to show I had not manufactured or moved things. I know it sounds over-fastidious, but evidence, once it leaves a place, needs a chain. I was learning that chain as we went. I could feel, in the curve of each small discovery, the shape of two very different choices: private arbitration that would smell, potentially, of polite corruption, or the long, grinding engine of law. Law moves slowly. It demands proof. It does not guarantee justice. But law also creates public records and offers a structure that can protect those who are harmed. I had been a parent long enough to know what silence can do. I could not, in good conscience, let a ledger be buried. I began to make quiet alliances. The first person I reached was a French police inspector named Claire Rousseau. I had read about her in a local paper, a careful, tenacious figure who had worked missing persons cases along the border. She answered on the evening of a Sunday with a voice that was both cautious and efficient. "Come in," she said. "We will look." She did more than look. She moved in the measured way of professionals who know risk. She advised me not to touch more than I already had. "Chain of custody," she said, an instruction as taught as grammar, and she arranged for discreet interviews with Marguerite and with other household employees. When I explained the ledger and the flash drive, she asked about a bank contact in Switzerland and made a note to consult a liaison in Geneva. She also asked me a question that settled heavy on my chest. "Do you think your son is aware of these arrangements?" I could not answer that question with anything but honesty. "I do not know," I said. What I could say, and what I did say, was that patterns pointed to an organized system of labor that was being concealed, and to a vocabulary of discretion that served interests beyond mere privacy. The ledger held entries that suggested payments to names which did not appear in the household staff lists, and the amounts were irregular, sometimes small, sometimes conspicuously large. There were abbreviations that read like codes. There was a line indicating a safe deposit, Vault 24, Geneva. Next to it, a date. Inspector Russo took statements and did something I admired. She did not promise quick action. "This is cross-border," she said. "We need a legal corridor." The phrase, unintentionally, was technical, like a map legend. I felt the machinery of law begin to unfold in her careful words. Local evidence, international liaison, confidential banking protocols, and the slow arbitration of prosecutors who are used to people and institutions that can make even subpoena requests look like polite negotiations. I called my son that evening. We spoke like people who keep rhythm with one another. I tried to make my voice ordinary. He was already defensive, understandably so, and his laughter came too quickly when I asked about the ledger. He said he had nothing to hide, that their home was private and their staff impeccable. He said his wife was fine and that my arrival was an unnecessary intrusion. He told me, in the way children tell a parent that everything is as it should be, that I needed to let them manage their household. I listened. I said I would be visiting for a few days, that I wanted to catch up, that I would leave the small things to their discretion. He sounded tired. His tone was sometimes distant, sometimes anxious. I wrote that down too. Tone as evidence. A week passed in which nothing dramatic occurred in public. The household continued its rituals, waking hours, meals served at prescribed times, separate sitting rooms where a person's face was deliberately placed out of focus. It was in that quiet routine that I did most of my work. I sat in corners like a student among books, observing. I recorded the way calls were routed through the house, how guests always seemed to be welcomed in groups where fewer questions were asked. I took tiny photographs. Again, the backs of chairs, a corner of a ledger page with a date, the brand label on a bottle that appeared in a picture. An offhand detail, a perfume bottle left on a windowsill, led me to a name of a supplier who, improbably, was linked to certain cleaning routes in nearby cities. One of the staff, a woman named Marguerite, began to trust my presence. She moved slower than everyone else, and her eyes found mine when she spoke, as if seeking a space for something to be said. She told me, in the quiet of a kitchen where the gas was not on and the kettle had taken its time to boil, that some of the women who came into the house worked long shifts, that their wages were sometimes described as allowances, and that reports of days off were recorded in a ledger I had not seen until then. "We are told to be discreet," she murmured. "It is a family thing." Her hands trembled when she spoke the word family. I had seen the same movement in my son's face when the glass shattered. Marguerite did something braver than most people imagine possible in a household of this size. She gave me access to a drawer where, among the household inventories and a stack of menus, she had tucked a small envelope containing photocopies of receipts, a foreign number that linked to a courier service, and a photocopy of a bank acknowledgement letter from Geneva. She slid it toward me like a test. "I have kept these," she said. "It is not for me to say more, but I cannot bear when people are kept away from their lives." That was how the ledger's line about Vault 24 gained corroboration. The acknowledgement letter was formal, an envelope stamped with a Swiss bank's mark, a dated log that matched one of the ledger entries. The letter did not say who owned the box. It merely confirmed the opening of a safe deposit with a procedural note that matched the date in the ledger. That single factual nugget made the ledger a key rather than a curiosity. A private family secret remains private until it touches an institution that leaves a trail. I brought these findings to Inspector Russo. She listened, her hands folded on the table the way a teacher might sit when a pupil brings evidence to prove an argument. We agreed that the next step required a higher-level contact, someone who could navigate Swiss banking confidentiality laws and the legal framework that allows for evidence to be requested across borders. She mentioned Interpol by name and asked if I could reach a point of contact in the United States or within international liaison offices. I had no direct contacts, but I did have a stubbornness that can be mistaken for resourcefulness. Through a colleague in an advocacy group back home, I was put in touch with Agent Sofia Martinez, an Interpol liaison whose job description reads like something out of a bureaucracy and who, in practice, acts like a surgeon, precise, unsentimental, and quick to coordinate across systems. She asked for the ledger pages and for time-stamped photographs. I sent what I had. She replied with an email that read simply, "We will open a file. Expect a call." When they call you with the machinery of institutions moving, you feel the weight of their procedures and the awkwardness of doing the right thing. Agent Martinez insisted on formality and on the necessity of protecting witnesses. "We cannot compromise operations," she wrote. "We will need to know whether the flash drive contains triggers, whether there are encrypted files, and if anyone else in the household has documentation." She also urged caution. Do not make public statements, and do not attempt to take unilateral steps that could endanger people still inside the household. All of this could have been an antiseptic sequence of emails, if not for the human gravity of it. My son's dismissal when I raised questions contrasted with the hush of legal staff and the keen attention of women like Marguerite, who lived the story daily. I found myself in a strange middle ground, parent and investigator at once. At night, I would sit up and read the ledger by lamplight, like a teacher preparing a lesson plan for a class of adults who were not yet ready to accept the syllabus. Names and amounts became the outlines of human lives. Some entries were small, payments that might be allowances for occasional help. Others were routine and regular, almost salary-like, but described in ways that skirted labor protections. Maintenance stipend, discretion fee. A pattern formed, labor described as contingency, women accounted for as episodic resources rather than people with hours and entitlements. The flash drive remained unopened in my hotel room drawer. There are reasons why people who work in evidence prefer to let designated technicians handle electronic media. A single mishandled click can render files inaccessible or compromise metadata that proves when something was created. I did not have the authority or the training to open it safely, but I did have curiosity, and curiosity in a parent can be as urgent as a dauntless instinct. I wrote the file name on the margins of a page in my notebook and let the phrase "dead man switch" rest, like a word you underline twice in a text you want to return to. Then came the envelope with the letter from Geneva. It arrived not by courier, but by a gentleman with a stiff posture and a soft voice, who asked for me by name at the house. He was not from the bank. At least, he did not represent himself as such. He introduced himself as a facilitator of international matters. His card read, Jean-Claude Marot. He used the language of high discretion. "Family first, always," he said, as if reciting a family motto. He offered the kind of solution that often greases the hinges of powerful doors, a private arbitration, mediated by a neutral party, resolution behind closed doors, and a dismissal of public spectacle. He used the ledger's word, discretion, like an assurance. He said it was often better to resolve these matters quietly, to protect reputations, and to repair without collateral damage. My instincts, shaped by both parenthood and professional ethics, bristled. Discretion is, for many, a kindness. For others, it is a shield. The ledger and the bank acknowledgement made discretion more suspect. I could see what Morrow proposed, a settlement that might secure my son's family from scandal. But I could also imagine what would be sacrificed in such a bargain: the rights of those whose names appeared in the ledger, the possible exploitation masked as domestic arrangement, the possibility that someone else would be left voiceless in exchange for silence. I told Morrow I would not make decisions in an envelope. He pursed his lips and said the matter might be painful for all involved. "Sometimes," he offered, "privacy is the only humane option." It was a plausible argument. I could see the faces of neighbors in my mind, thinking of a family's dignity. I could see my son's exhaustion, but I could also see the ledger's rows and the way the word discretion had been used to categorize labor. If you dispose of the ledger, you dispose of the evidence. If you dispose of the evidence, you make the system resilient. We reached a tipping point when Marguerite, in a hush as if confiding in a pupil, told me that at least 2 women had been moved quietly between the chateau and properties in another country, listed in the ledger as itinerant maintenance. They did not appear in the work schedules filed with the local labor office. They had, according to Marguerite, been paid in cash and lodged in places where their communications were limited. I will not name them. I will not describe their faces. What I will say is this: when labor is hidden beneath hospitality, when the language of family becomes a tool for concealment, exploitation is easier to sustain. At that point, private arbitration ceased to be an ethical shelter. It would protect the household's name and possibly soothe my son's immediate worries, but it would not create the public record or legal protections that could prevent future harm. I made the decision that would, in later weeks, be described by people who know bureaucracy as both brave and reckless. I told Inspector Rousseau that I wanted to secure the ledger properly, to have forensic copies of the flash drive, and to open a formal file that could be taken to Switzerland. The ledger was modest, leather-bound, and ordinary in its materials. The consequences, however, stretched across borders. Agent Martinez agreed that the Geneva contact was essential. She warned of the difficulty. Swiss banking laws are among the most protective in the world. Banks can be cooperative when compelled by judicial assistance requests, but the process is technical and can be delayed by appeals and the institution's concern for client confidentiality. "It is legal choreography," she wrote once, "and we will need partners in Geneva." She suggested the correct route: prepare a dossier, preserve all chain of custody material, and request assistance through official channels. In parallel, she said, consider witness protection for any staff who might fear reprisal. This procedural language, while dry, carried high emotion behind it. Every request for legal assistance is a plea for another country to pierce its own protocols on your behalf. It demands paperwork and patience, 2 things at odds with the urgency I felt when I saw a person's body hidden under elegance. But urgency without care invites mistakes. I learned to steady myself like a teacher before a class that will struggle with a difficult text. We will read carefully. We will not rush to conclusions. When I told my son we were moving forward with formal requests, he was quiet. I read the pause like an editor reading a line that has a missing adjective. He said he wanted to manage things from his home. He asked me to trust his judgment. Trust is, in family relations, a necessary currency, but trust must be tempered by responsibility. I could not set aside the ledger because my son asked it. I could not let discretion, as a euphemism, override the possibility that people in that ledger were being deprived of rights and autonomy. In the days that followed, preparing the dossier became a kind of work I would not have anticipated for myself at my age. I scanned the ledger under different light, photographed receipts with timestamps, and indexed every detail. I kept a log of conversations with a level of care that made me feel like an old colleague returning to the textbooks. Who I spoke to, the time, a short summary. It was methodical and, in its own way, comforting. I did not expect gratitude for doing this. I expected resistance, appeals, delays. That did not stop me. The most disquieting moment arrived when an envelope, thick and cream, was left at my bedroom door. Inside was an invitation to a private dinner, elegant, unassuming, signed only by Catherine Beaumont, the name that had cropped up as a patron in several correspondences linked to the chateau's renovations. There was no overt threat in the letter. It was a social offering, a soft hint that certain conversations are better held across white tablecloths. It felt like a courtesy. It also felt like a test. I sent the letter, with a scanned copy, to Inspector Rousseau and to Agent Martinez. They understood what soft pressure can do. Politely decline, Inspector Rousseau advised. Do not meet without counsel present. There was a legal prudence to her words. People in positions of power can turn invitations into entrapments, offering conversation cloaked as civility while trying to steer decisions away from public processes. My instinct told me that a private dinner could be a place where discretion is reinforced. I declined, noting instead that any conversation had to be held within the frame of legal counsel. By then, the ledger had become more than a book. It was a hinge on which decisions would turn. The word "if," the flash drive, started to look less like an apocalyptic note and more like a protective measure someone had taken in private. Dead man switches are not always about malice. Sometimes they are the work of someone who fears they might be deprived of their voice and wants to make sure that a record survives. That the flash drive was lodged behind a ledger, labeled in shorthand, suggested premeditation and an awareness that documents might one day be needed to speak for absent people. I am careful here because the title of this account frames my son in a particular way, and I do not want to presume legal guilt. The ledger indicates there was a system in place that treated labor as contingent and that used private arrangements to bypass visible scrutiny. How directly my son was involved in the creation or maintenance of that system was, at the time I began to gather evidence, unclear. He was present in the house. His name appeared in context as the host and as a person associated with certain entries. Whether he had signed contracts, orchestrated payments, or remained willfully ignorant of what the ledger recorded, that was not something I could claim without proof. I will tell you what I found and what others found, and where the facts did not allow me to be certain, I will say so plainly. There is a grief in learning systemic cruelty amid seeming domestic normalcy. Families are convenient covers. Hospitality can be a vocabulary of concealment. I felt that grief and also a duty to translate it into substance. I reached out quietly to a lawyer known to work on labor rights in international cases. She, too, read the ledger and gave a measured assessment. We can pursue mutual legal assistance if we can connect names to accounts and if we can show patterns of labor exploitation. It will take time and careful anchor points. Her use of the word anchor was precise. A bank acknowledgement, an employee statement, the flash drive's metadata. These would become anchors for any request to unlock a Swiss safe deposit. It was in that week, after a late-night call with Agent Martinez, who had confirmed an Interpol file number, that a small, decisive maneuver occurred. We arranged for a formal written request to be prepared, and I agreed to travel to Geneva to be present when the bank was approached should the legal route be granted. The idea of confronting a vault in Geneva felt theatrically decisive. The practicalities were less cinematic. There would be forms, translators, subpoenas. There would be teams of lawyers and bank personnel who are trained to manage requests while defending client confidentiality. But there would also be a place where physical evidence could be seen under professional eyes. The decision to go to Geneva was, I confess, as much emotional as legal. Part of me wanted to stand in front of a bank official and point to the ledger like one points to a blackboard where the thesis is written. Another part knew the actual work would be slower and more procedural. I packed a notebook and a pen that had always been my favorite for drafting letters. The notebook felt like a familiar tool, the same one that had carried lesson plans and marking schemes, and now it would carry evidence. Before I left, my son and I had a conversation that is now one of the memories I return to when I try to place blame or mercy. He asked me, simply, if I loved him. It was not a rhetorical question. It was the human question at the heart of every family rupture. Yes, I said. That does not mean I will let things be hidden. He did not answer immediately. He said only that he feared the publicity more than he feared the law. Publicity can ruin people, he said. I told him that publicity is not the same as accountability. He asked for patience. I told him I would try to be patient, but that patience would not equal silence. In the early hours of the morning as I packed, Marguerite came to my door and pressed a small folded paper into my hand. "If you go," she said, "take this." It was a list, names of women whose schedules did not match the household roster, dates that overlapped, and one line that said simply, "Afternoon, opera." I put the paper into my notebook as if it were a bookmark. I left France with that slender load of evidence and a determination that felt both principled and precarious. I had arranged for copies to be stored in multiple places. I had a dossier ready on my laptop. I had a chain of custody log that began with the time I found the ledger and the steps I had taken since. Above all, I had decided that discretion could no longer be the verb that excused silence. The plane to Geneva is short. From the window seat, I watched fields and small towns slip by, ordinary and unremarkable. It is a peculiar and humbling thing to go to a bank on behalf of people whose faces you do not know, but whose lives your sketching may help to straighten. When you cross a border with the intention of asking another country to open a vault, you are doing more than collecting a box. You are seeking recognition that what happens inside private walls can affect the public good. I arrived in Geneva with the ledger in my shoulder bag and a calm that comes from doing homework thoroughly. I had arranged, through Agent Martinez, for an initial meeting with a legal liaison at the bank. She met me in a small conference room with large windows that overlooked a calm river. The bank liaison was courteous to the point of being almost clinical. She asked for the legal filings and the mutual assistance request. I handed her the ledger photocopies and watched the way professionals assess documents. Eyes on pagination, notes on margins, requests for originals. "We will need an official request," she said. "We will not open client property without appropriate judicial instrument." I knew that. I expected it. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, to see a box. It is strange, in the quiet of that room, to feel the impatience of justice. There is the recognition, practical and moral, that institutions have their rules. There is also the knowledge that rules can be complied with when people are determined. Agent Martinez had already set wheels in motion with Interpol and with a Swiss prosecutor who had shown, at least on paper, a willingness to consider a request if anchored properly. The bank liaison offered a procedural roadmap: submit the request through the legal channel, allow time for review, and, if successful, arrange an opening of Vault 24 in the presence of an authorized representative. It was not a promise. It was a path. As I sat there, looking at the river and the pages, I felt the story sharpen into two fronts. One that was administrative, the forms, the subpoenas, the requests, and one that was human, the women listed in the ledger, the staff coerced into quiet labor, my son, the steward who risked her job to share documents. Both fronts required different kinds of courage. The legal path demanded patience and accuracy. The human path demanded protection and immediacy. I had made a choice not to pursue private arbitration. I had made another choice, to be present, in person, in a place where a vault might be opened and where evidence could be inspected under proper protocol. The ledger, the flash drive, the bank acknowledgement, they were the threads I thought might tie together a case. They were also the fragile things that could break under legal pressure or be buried under appeals. At the back of my mind I carried the image of the champagne glass and the crescent bruise, a small domestic disaster that had become the hinge on which all of this turned. When the bank liaison folded the request form toward me and said she would forward it to her legal team for review, I realized that the real test was not arriving in Geneva, but waiting there. Waiting is a difficult place to be when urgency is the tone of your interior life. I have learned, teaching teenagers, that waiting is a skill, the ability to hold questions without rushing to answer, to let evidence accumulate like sediment. I sat with that knowledge and began to prepare for the next stage, a careful opening of a vault that might or might not contain the key to understanding what the ledger hinted at. Before I left Geneva to return briefly to France to meet with counsel and to arrange for formal witness statements, I made one last entry in my notebook. It was a list, almost a syllabary of required things: chain of custody, witness statements, legal requests, and contingency for public disclosure if the ledger revealed patterns indicative of exploitation. I wrote the words with the calm insistence of a teacher setting an exam. Clear criteria, clear expectations. On the morning I took the train back to France, the station was bustling with people heading about ordinary errands. A woman with a small dog waited on the platform. A man in a suit read the financial pages. I felt, for a moment, both extremely small and extremely accountable. The ledger had transformed my holiday into a work of testimony. The flash drive waited in a secure envelope in my bag. Vault 24 existed now as more than a line in a ledger. It had become a destination for truth. When I stepped back into the chateau that evening, the house seemed unchanged. The silver mirror still reflected the late light. My son was at the foot of a staircase that had always seemed to my memory to have a gentleness in its curve. He looked at me with the kind of expression that asks whether the trip has helped or wounded. I did not answer his look with accusations. I told him, simply, that I had asked for help from authorities, and that I had gone to Geneva to initiate legal requests. He inhaled as if to take a word and hold it steady. "What are you aiming for?" he asked. I put my hand on the ledger once more, as if to reassure a figure of paper and ink that its notes were meant to speak for people. "I want a proper account," I said. "I want facts to be examined, and for people, whoever they are, to be safe." He nodded, not entirely reluctantly, but with a gravity I recognized. Perhaps he feared the possibility of change as much as he feared public exposure. Perhaps he feared that the family's privacy would be pierced. I understood that fear. I also knew that privacy cannot be a blanket for harm. That night, as sleep refused me, I thought of the small ribbon of a file labeled "If." Whatever was on that flash drive could be the voice of someone who had reason to prepare for absence. Or it could be emptiness. Dead man switches are not melody. Dead man switches are not melodramatic theater. They are a hedge against erasure. They are a person's way of saying, quietly and without flourish, "If I do not get to tell this, make sure someone else can." So I folded that tiny slip of paper, "If," into my notebook and let its weight keep me awake at odd hours. The legal requests moved in fits and starts. Swiss procedure required formal mutual assistance letters, translations, certified statements. What felt like a small triumph one week, an email acknowledging receipt of paperwork, could be undercut the next by a procedural query or a request for better anchoring documentation. Agent Martinez, who came to feel like the steady rubric in a complicated exam, kept me updated with a blunt kindness. "Expect delays," she would write. "Expect appeals. Keep your chain." There was a moment in the middle of these bureaucratic stretches that crystallized the moral geometry of what we were doing. A prosecutor in Geneva, whose name I will not give here because it is procedural, not central, asked to see the original ledger and the flash drive under secure conditions. We arranged a controlled evidence transfer. The ledger, its photocopies, the envelope of documents Marguerite had provided, and the flash drive, all placed in evidence bags and documented in sequence. A notarized log accompanied every movement. I watched the ledger go into a seal and then into the hands of people trained to treat objects as witnesses. It felt, oddly, like the ledger was finally being read in a court that would ask it questions it could not answer alone. The bank required judicial instruments to open Vault 24. That instrument arrived, belatedly but decisively, after the Swiss prosecutor filed a request for access on the basis of suspicion of labor exploitation and related financial irregularities. When the day was set, Agent Martinez asked me to be present as a witness to the chain of custody. Inspector Rousseau arranged for a translator and for a liaison to accompany us. I deliberately dressed unremarkably, neutral shoes, a coat that did not shout, and brought only the one notebook and the one pen that had by now become a faithful talisman. The vault room itself was the opposite of theatrical. Fluorescent light, polished steel, and a long wooden table where officials arranged documents with a care that felt like reverence. Vault 24 was not a cinematic chest. It was a blind metal box in a line of blind metal boxes. The lock turned with the unromantic hum of mechanical certainty. A representative from the bank and a legal officer from the prosecutor's office opened it in the presence of the checklist we had prepared. When the lid lifted, the contents were modest: a stack of envelopes, a number of labeled diaries, and yes, a small sealed box with a USB drive inside. Nothing spectacular, no theatrical cash, but the sum of these items mattered. Documents drift like dust. In bulk, they are a history. Those envelopes held contracts and invoices, some typed, some handwritten. There were receipts that matched entries in the ledger and correspondence that referenced arrangements and schedules. A line of names, some matching the ledger, some not. A small spiral notebook contained shorthand notes about shifts and lodgings, enough, when placed next to witness statements and bank acknowledgments, to paint a pattern. The flash drive, when handled by forensic technicians, contained audio files and photo folders. I will not describe those files in a way that could identify anyone. I will only say that the drive contained material that corroborated, professionally and technically, some of the ledger's entries. At the same time, the bank notes included an internal memo that mentioned a patron, Catherine Beaumont, who had powerfully recommended certain privacy practices and had sometimes acted as a fiscal intermediary. The memo did not assert criminality. It simply recorded an institutional observation. Certain accounts and deposit activities had been coordinated through a named facilitator. That note became a point of contact we could not ignore. The bank's legal team did not open the entire content of client materials to public view. Swiss law required judicial oversight and strict limitations on disclosure. The prosecutor petitioned to use certain files as evidence, and the bank, following procedure, allowed limited viewing under supervision. That division between what is seen and what remains confidential is a moral hinge. Banks have obligations to both client privacy and to laws seeking to remedy wrongdoing. There is no tidy moral arithmetic here. There is, instead, a set of careful legal moves that require time and stamina. When Agent Martinez said, "We can move," she meant it in the specific language of operation. Interpol coordinated with Austrian authorities led by Inspector Klaus Müller. Local French police coordinated raids with Inspector Rousseau. The plan was a choreography of caution. Simultaneous searches at multiple properties to prevent evidence from being destroyed, provisional freezing orders to limit asset movement, and protection measures for witnesses and staff whose cooperation would place them at risk. The dead man's switch, what the drive could trigger, was both a literal and symbolic insurance. Its presence changed leverage. It meant that certain players could no longer assume that irritation or threat would silence the narrative into oblivion. We decided against public announcements until the rescue operations were underway. There is an ethical weight to secrecy in these cases. Premature disclosure can endanger women still inside the properties, can move suspects to destroy evidence, and can complicate cross-border cooperation. I understood the frustrating tension. My instinct as a parent wanted to tell every neighbor, to broadcast injustice like a teacher bringing a problem into full view. But operational prudence demanded patience. On an early morning in spring, cars with tinted windows and low-profile markings converged on the chateau, an estate in the soft edge of an otherwise quiet parish. The coordinated operation involved French National Police, Swiss prosecutors present in a liaison role, Interpol agents, and an Austrian team ready to execute related warrants. I watched the operation from a distance specified by the investigators. I was not part of tactical entry, only of the legal and moral presence that would later testify to evidence handling and chain of custody. The entry into the chateau was forbiddingly quick. Officers moved with precision, cataloging rooms, opening locked cabinets, and securing evidence. For the women who were found inside, some awake, some sleeping, many frightened, the scene was bewildering, but ultimately relieving. They were given clothes, water, medical checks, and immediate access to social workers. An NGO team that had been briefed in advance set up an emergency reception area in a nondescript municipal building near the estate. Blanket-covered figures, silent and exhausted, were led into warmth and into the models of care that exist in places where systems are used to address sudden rescue. Some people were arrested that day. In legal language, several individuals were detained on suspicion and later formally arrested as prosecutors built cases. A few were charged with related offenses, and some remained under investigation. The names of the arrested were not all the same as those on the ledger. The web that had been recorded in small script sprawled wider than any single household. That was one of the lessons of the raids. Institutional exploitation is often organized across networks, not contained within a single property. I will not describe the women we found in detail. Their faces, their names, their trauma, all privacies to be respected. One woman, who later agreed to be called Katrina for public testimony, told a short, halting account through an advocate. She had been promised safe employment, had been moved across borders on irregular timetables, and had been paid inconsistently. She had, she said, learned to keep quiet because those were the rules she had been given. Her testimony, preserved and supported by a skilled interpreter and a shelter team, fit into the pattern the ledger and the vault content suggested. The Vienna Opera sting was a separate move, an operation built on the principle that some people speak freely when they think civility protects them. A high society gala had been identified as an event where certain facilitators and patrons might let their guard down. With careful legal planning and intelligence work, Inspector Miller and his team taking the lead in Austria, agents recorded conversations that later proved, in redacted form, useful to prosecutors. Again, I emphasize restraint. What was captured was not salacious spectacle. It was, instead, practical language about movements, payments, and scheduling that aligned with entries in the ledger and with bank records. That kind of recorded dialogue is not cinematic. It is evidentiary. After the raids and recordings, the immediate joy of rescues gave way to the slower, lonelier work of legal processing. Evidence must be cataloged. Witness statements must be taken with trauma-informed care. Forensic examinations must be conducted. Hospitals and social services become long-term partners. In some cases, prosecutors moved quicker than expected and filed charges. In other cases, evidence that seemed strong in the ledger faced legal defenses filed by well-resourced counsel. Banks, too, resisted on technical grounds: client confidentiality, procedural safeguards, and appeals that stretched into months. The legal system, for all its promise, is designed to be thorough, and thoroughness is disorienting to those who seek rapid moral closure. During that time, family life tilted. My son was questioned as part of the inquiry, interviewed, asked to provide documents, and requested to give account of his presence and awareness. He cooperated in many ways, providing access to rooms and consenting to searches. He was, in Inspector Russo's words, a person of interest for clarifying testimony, but not, at that stage, the target of a specific criminal charge based on incontrovertible evidence. That phrasing, person of interest, is an awkward category in ordinary speech. It means you are part of the puzzle. It does not mean you are the fraudster. In private conversations, he told me he had not known the ledger's full extent, and that he had assumed certain arrangements were standard for people in their social circles. He was defensive at times, shattered at others. I kept holding the balance between maternal protection and moral responsibility. There were, inevitably, critics who asked why I had not gone to the press earlier. I knew the accusation before it arrived, that a mother should have shouted sooner. I also knew the countervailing jurisdictional facts, that press before process risks lives. My son and I had multiple conversations about publicity. He feared reputational ruin. I feared that silence would be a shield for exploitation. We navigated that tension, not with easy answers, but with repeated negotiations. He provided documents. He launched into interviews with counsel. He sought to distance himself from decisions he said he had not made. The legal record would, in time, decide what part his actions played. I cannot and will not substitute public moral certainty for judicial fact-finding. Some outcomes were small victories. Provisional asset freezes prevented movement of funds tied to certain accounts, which aided in a slow restitution process for some women. Some legal filings led to temporary injunctions against certain facilitators. Other outcomes were ambiguous. Appeals postponed certain hearings, and some charges were mitigated to lesser counts in plea bargains. The patchwork of outcomes reflected an uncomfortable truth. Justice in cross-border exploitation cases is often incremental and incomplete. It tests patience the way a long-marked essay taxis under a red pen, slow, meticulous, and sometimes unsatisfying. The public and parliamentary response, however, was an unexpected lever. The case's cross-border nature and the involvement of Swiss banking raised questions that a single-family drama could not contain. Advocacy groups, partners who had been quietly involved during rescue phases, pushed for hearings. A parliamentary committee in the country where the bank was located called for testimony about bank secrecy laws and their implications in suspected human trafficking cases. The Ledger and Vault 24 were cited, cautiously and with legal redactions, to make the case that financial opacity can enable exploitation. Lawmakers proposed modest reforms, greater transparency protocols when a safe deposit box is suspected to be used in illegal activity, and clarified channels for expedited judicial requests in certain trafficking investigations. These recommendations did not transform law overnight, but they opened conversation. At home, the aftermath included the slower, tender work that does not make headlines. Women who had been found in the properties needed psychological care, legal counsel, language assistance, and pathways to either return safely to their communities or to resettle with protections. NGOs provided long-term shelter and vocational assistance. I visited several times, not to be a public figure at their side, but to sit and listen and to learn how systems could be better. One woman, whose name I protect, taught me how little a formal allowance can cover when a person is denied days off or when wages are withheld. Another insisted we build a checklist for workers, one that would make rights visible and that could be used by embassies and shelters as a first-line tool. From those modest practicalities grew the idea of a foundation. My son did not take this as a gesture of absolution. He took it as our attempt to make systemic what we had experienced privately. We collaborated with existing NGOs rather than build a separate empire. Training programs for consular staff on how to spot ledger-like patterns, modules for social workers about financial red flags, and seminars for financial institutions on how to respond to certain alerts without breaching privacy laws. We funded legal clinics that could assist domestic workers who lacked representation and supported hotlines that operate across languages. Part of what the Foundation tried to do, what we insisted upon, was to translate the ledger's small notations into accessible language. Maintenance stipend became a phrase we explained in workshops. What that label could mean in practice, why it might hide irregular wages, and what steps a diplomat or neighbor could take if they suspected exploitation. We drafted easy guides for those who work in hospitality, in real estate, and in banking, sectors that touch domestic arrangements and where vigilance might stop a pattern before it becomes networked. There was a quieter, more personal reckoning, too. My son and I sat, more than once, under the old silver mirror that had once simply reflected late light and family portraits. We spoke of choices. He admitted he had been complacent at times, taking the explanation of arrangement for granted. He did not confess to criminal orchestration, and I do not assert that he did. He did, however, apologize for not hearing what was happening in his own house. That was not a legal statement. It was a human one. He volunteered to testify, to provide whatever documents he had, and to work with counsel to repair wrongs where he could help. Whether that would translate into legal culpability was not ours to determine. The trials followed familiar rhythms: plea negotiations here, a contested hearing there, appeals that stretched the calendar. For victims, the legal timetable is often another test of endurance. Some cases concluded with convictions, others with plea agreements that included restitution and community service. Others still languished in appellate limbo. I do not want to suggest that justice was uniform. It was not. But the public record that emerged, the ledger, the bank acknowledgments, the recorded conversations, made an imprint. Institutions had to pay attention. There is a moral calculus to be made about secrecy and discretion. Catherine Beaumont, the patronial figure who had once offered private arbitration, attended one of the hearings as a witness. She maintained, through counsel, that her involvement had been philanthropic and advisory. Others alleged that her influence had encouraged practices that privileged reputation over labor rights. Those are contested claims, and as such, the procedural record balanced testimony and evidence with cross-examination. I include that because it matters. Powerful people can make things look ordinary, and ordinary can hide exploitation. The ledger was a small but resilient object that made ordinariness speak. After the immediate legal matters cooled into a slow, ongoing set of hearings and bureaucratic reforms, I began to travel less as a plaintiff and more as an advocate. We used the experience to lobby for better cross-border procedures, for clearer obligations on banks when presented with suspicious patterns, and for funding that supports shelters and training programs. The Foundation organized a symposium that included bank compliance officers, labor rights lawyers, and social workers. We argued for practical steps: better guidance to bank staff about when to escalate suspicious patterns, fast-track judicial assistance requests in trafficking cases, and support lines for domestic workers where language and mobility are barriers. There were critiques. Some said the Foundation's work leaned too much into the financial side and not enough into social reintegration. Others said we were naive to imagine that banks would change without legal teeth. These criticisms were partly fair and partly the inevitable friction of trying to turn personal harm into institutional learning. We adjusted, slowly. We funded more direct service work and pushed for legislative measures that gave prosecutors clearer channels to request safe deposit box searches when probable cause existed. Reform is never as simple as it seems in the glow of moral clarity. On a quieter scale, there was restoration of relationship. My son and I rebuilt trust in the only way I know how to repair trust: with time, with accountability, and with deeds. He worked with activists, volunteered at the shelter, and began to speak in workshops about how one can be complicit through omission. He did not seek absolution. He sought understanding. To be candid, some in our extended family never forgave him. Others sought to keep distance. Families are messy ecosystems, and scandal prunes them in ways that are sometimes necessary and sometimes cruel. As the legal processes matured, I found the ledger sitting in my notebook less as an instrument of accusation and more as an index of what can be noticed. It is a strange thing to turn a private wrong into a public warning. One part grief, one part responsibility. I learned to teach again in a different register. Workshops became my small classroom. I taught diplomats how to read ledgers for signs of labor irregularity. I taught social workers how to build trust with potential victims. I taught bank compliance officers the vocabulary of suspicion that can coexist with law. There are practical fragments I will share because they may help others. Insist on formal contracts for domestic work. Ensure wages are recorded transparently and not as allowances. Check that employees have independent means of communication and are permitted days off. Be wary of euphemisms that mask labor obligations. These are not magic remedies. They are checkpoints, pedagogical nodes in a complex system. I also want to say plainly what we did not do. We did not, as a family, seek to destroy reputations out of spite. We did not weaponize the ledger for personal vendettas. We did not leak evidence recklessly. We made hard choices about publicizing information, when publicity would advance public safety and when it risked harm. Those choices are messy and contested. We made them with counsel and with the input of victims' advocates. The case had consequences beyond our immediate circle. Some banks reviewed their procedures. One institution adopted more explicit internal training on how to escalate suspicious activity when private dynastic arrangements intersect with irregular employment patterns. A parliamentary committee recommended clearer channels for mutual legal assistance in suspected trafficking cases. A local NGO received donations earmarked for legal assistance to domestic workers. These shifts are modest, but real. They are the kind of small changes that, over time, can alter the environment that allows exploitation to persist. There is, inevitably, a sobering sentence to add. Systems adapt, and those who wish to conceal wrongdoing are adept at learning new euphemisms. The ledger was only one form of record-keeping. New schemes appear. New codes are invented. That is why a single operation, however successful, cannot be an endpoint. Advocacy must be ongoing. Institutions must be vigilant. Laws must evolve. I do not conclude this account with full resolution. Some cases that touched this story continued to move through appeals and administrative reviews long after the initial rescues. Some survivors rebuilt their lives privately and chose not to participate in public processes. Some people faced charges and were convicted. Others negotiated plea agreements that included restitution and community service. The outcomes were mixed because human institutions are imperfect and because legal systems are, in their best form, careful and slow. There is one more domestic scene I want to describe because it changed how I understood my own responsibilities as a parent and as a citizen. After several months, my son and I sat at that same kitchen table with Marguerite present. She had been suspended during investigations, but later became a willing witness and a steady advisor. We shared a teapot. Words were cautious. Marguerite told a small anecdote about a woman who had once hummed a tune freely in the kitchen before she had been moved from schedule to schedule. The woman's freedom to hum was the anecdotal emblem of autonomy. Listening to her hum was, in that household, once an ordinary joy denied. My son listened and did not look away. He began to speak, not just to me, but to those he had failed to hear, about how privacy had been used as a smokescreen and how responsibility requires active listening. If you are listening to this account because the title pulled you, because you saw in it a personal drama, a family rupture, know that the personal and the systemic are braided. One person's small inattention can facilitate a system that harms thousands. One ledger in a drawer, noticed by a single attentive hand, can unravel a network. A practical plea I will make is simple. If you see a pattern, that ubiquitous word discretion used repeatedly to describe labor arrangements, if you see payments described in euphemism, if you notice people systematically kept out of photographs or schedules, it is worth making a private record. Not to accuse, but to preserve. Take notes. Store copies outside the place. Tell someone who can advise you. An NGO, a labor lawyer, a consular officer. Those are not tactical instructions for evasion. They are steps for preserving evidence with care. A word on the fact adaptation in this narrative. This account is told with the title, Framing My Child as My Son. The source material that shaped the investigative arc described a daughter in a similar position. In adapting the story to the title, I have kept the investigative facts, the ledger, the Swiss vault, the dead man switch, the coordinated raids, intact, while shifting relational pronouns and dynamics to match a mother-son frame. Where the original material did not clearly establish my son's direct actions, I have stated uncertainty plainly, and avoided asserting criminal culpability without documented evidence. Those elements remain indefinito, in the sense that the narrative describes associations, presence, and cooperation with investigators, but not necessarily criminal orchestration. That ambiguity is intentional and truthful. At the end of all this, some practical points remain. The foundation we helped create has a resource list that we publish and update, hotlines, NGO partners, and guidance documents. We collaborate with law clinics that offer pro bono support and with consular services that can advise on cross-border movements. The work never ends because systems reform is iterative. There is sorrow and there is a kind of tempered hope. Sorrow for those whose autonomy was constrained and for families ripped between loyalty and justice. Hope because some lives were rescued, because some reforms were put on paper, and because the ledger's small notations, once hidden, are now part of a public conversation about what constitutes decent labor and humane treatment. If you have followed this account and you want to continue following the work, if this story stirs you to learn more or to act, please subscribe so you will see the ongoing materials where we publish resources and guidance. There is much more to learn and practice than any single story can contain. The last scene I will offer is quiet. Some months after the trials and hearings slowed into the usual legal cadence, I went back to the chateau. The mirror still caught the late light. My son walked with me through rooms that had been a battleground of privacy and secrecy. We did not speak plainly of blame. We spoke of repair. He has since volunteered with the foundation. He sits sometimes with those he once failed to notice and listens. Repair is not a single act. It is a daily practice. There are no grand finalities in this story. Some people faced accountability to the extent the law allowed. Some institutions implemented modest reforms. Some survivors pursued legal restitution or chose private resettlement. Some of the defendants appealed. Some cases continue. But the ledger was read. Vault 24 was opened under legal supervision. People were rescued. Networks were exposed enough to prompt legislative conversation. That is not the same as perfect justice. It is, however, substantive change, small, contested, and necessary. If this story has moved you and you want to act, please look to the links in the description below for vetted resources, hotlines, NGO partners, and the Foundation's page where we list legal clinics and support networks. If you have a similar experience, please consider contacting professionals rather than posting identifying information online. Public details can harm survivors and complicate investigations. I still keep the same pen I used during the ledger moment. Sometimes I write lesson plans for the training sessions we give. Sometimes I write notes to myself, small admonitions about noticing, about recording, about patience. I am a teacher at heart. I cannot help but turn events into lessons. The greatest lesson this episode taught me is that silence and deference, even when dressed as respect, can be weapons that maintain harm. The smallest detail, a rag behind a cushion, a notation in a margin, can be the hinge of a case. We chose the ledger and the law over private arbitration because we believed, imperfectly and with risk, that public accountability offers protection not just for one family, but for many nameless people recorded in the margins. That choice cost us privacy and introduced pain. It also opened space for rescue and reform. If you carry this story away, carry with it a practical patience. Notice, document, consult trusted advocates, and protect potential victims. Keep faith in institutions long enough to make them work better, but do not abdicate the moral responsibility to see clearly. Thank you for listening. If you want the resources I mentioned, hotlines, NGO contacts, and guidance for preserving evidence safely, please check the links in the description or visit the Foundation's page. Share this story thoughtfully with someone who might benefit, but please avoid posting identifying details in public comments. Above all, remain watchful. Discretion should never be a synonym for silence when people's lives are at stake.